One man, impossible to see, made an entire army afraid of silence. War obeys simple and seemingly unbreakable rules. Offensives are stopped by armies. Territory is taken by numbers. Breakthroughs are achieved by artillery, equipment, and overwhelming superiority of force. One man, in this logic, decides nothing. He is too small, too vulnerable, and disappears too quickly in the statistics of losses. Military regulations, operational maps, and calculations are always based on the same assumption. A threat has a form. It has numbers, direction, and a front line. It can be fought if it is visible, if it can be marked on a map, if it is possible to understand where exactly it comes from. The Soviet command entered the Winter War with precisely this understanding. Finland seemed weak, small in number, and unprepared for a large-scale conflict. Large formations, columns of equipment, and thousands of soldiers were advanced against it. Under such conditions, resistance was expected to be broken quickly and without serious complications. Winter was considered a difficulty, but not a decisive factor. Frost, snow, and forests were taken into account in calculations, but were not perceived as something capable of changing the very logic of war. It was assumed that numerical superiority would compensate for any inconvenience of the terrain. But already, in the first weeks, strange figures began to appear in the reports. Losses were growing, but there were no explanations. There were no artillery strikes. There were no large engagements. There was not even a clear understanding of the enemy. Soldiers simply did not return from the forest. These losses looked especially alarming precisely because they were not accompanied by battle. There was no smoke, no explosions, no chaos of attack. People went out on assignments and disappeared, sometimes one by one, sometimes in groups, sometimes entire units that simply stopped responding. You move forward through the snow and expect to see the enemy, but instead there is only silence, white, dense, pressing. No traces of movement, no sounds of battle, only frost, the crunch of snow under your feet, and the feeling that you are being watched. You do not hear a shot, you do not see a flash. You do not even understand what happened. At some point, there is simply one person less beside you, and no one can say where death came from. Commanders demand reports, but the reports give no answers. How can people be lost without seeing the one who kills them? How can a unit disappear where, according to all calculations, nothing should be happening? This situation does not fit into any instruction or any scheme. A system built on numbers and directions begins to fail. It is unable to register a threat that has no familiar form. The threat does not attack frontally. It does not advance. It simply exists. It is at this moment that the familiar rule of war begins to crack, because it becomes obvious that this is not an army, not a unit, and not even a group that is acting here. Something else. Something that does not fit into any idea of how war is supposed to look. In the winter of 1939, the Soviet army did not yet know one thing. Sometimes one man is enough to stop an offensive, and sometimes that man becomes not a soldier, but a force of nature. The Winter War quickly stops looking like a conventional campaign. What was supposed to be a rapid advance turns into a slow and exhausting movement through forests and snowfields. Every kilometer costs time, strength, and people. The environment itself begins to work against the advancing troops. The Finnish side does not try to meet the enemy head-on. There are no large counterattacks, no attempts to stop the advance with direct force. Instead, the resistance dissolves into the landscape. Small groups appear and disappear. The forest absorbs them, and the cold finishes what bullets do not. Among this resistance, there is one figure who does not stand out by rank or position. No special uniform, no command authority, no radio, only experience, patience, and absolute knowledge of the terrain. This man does not seek confrontation. He waits. Simo Häyhä was a hunter long before he became a soldier. He knew how to remain motionless for hours. He knew how sound travels through snow. He knew how cold changes breathing, movement, and attention. The winter was not an obstacle for him. It was a tool. He does not use an optical sight. Glass can reflect light. A single glare is enough to give away a position. Instead, he relies on iron sights and instinct. He presses snow into his mouth so that his breath does not form steam. He merges with the white landscape until the difference between man and forest disappears. For those advancing through the forest, there is no warning, no movement, no sound. The shot comes from nowhere, and then nothing follows. No further fire, no visible enemy, only another body in the snow. Attempts to respond lead nowhere. Return fire hits empty space. Artillery cannot be used effectively against a threat that has no fixed position. Reinforcements arrive too late. The forest remains silent. Each successful shot strengthens the same effect: uncertainty, fear, hesitation. Soldiers begin to look not forward, but around themselves. Every shadow becomes suspicious. Every pause feels dangerous. Attention shifts from orders to survival. The logic of advancement begins to collapse. Speed decreases. Formations tighten. Progress slows. All this is caused not by a breakthrough or a defensive line, but by the presence of someone who cannot be located. At this stage, no one knows his name. No one understands how many there are. Command assumes it is a group. Intelligence searches for networks. But the truth is simpler and more unsettling. This is not a unit. This is not a system. This is one man acting in conditions where the system stops working. And the longer he remains invisible, the more power he gains over those who are supposed to be advancing. At first, no one understands what is happening. Losses continue, but they cannot be connected into a single picture. There is no front line, no direction of attack, not even the feeling of battle. Soldiers go into the forest and do not return. Sometimes a single shot is heard. Sometimes nothing is heard at all. Most often, silence remains complete. You walk through the snow-covered forest and feel the cold penetrating beneath your clothing. Snow muffles footsteps. Branches do not move. Visibility is limited to a few dozen meters. Everything around looks the same. White, motionless, lifeless. Here it is impossible to understand where the danger is, because it does not reveal itself in any way. Soviet units begin to reinforce security. Sentries are posted. Soldiers stare into the forest, expecting to see the enemy. But the enemy does not appear. He does not attack. He does not fight. He waits. Simo Häyhä has already taken his position. He remains in the snow for hours. His body is almost completely hidden. His weapon is prepared in advance. He does not move, does not change position, does not react to the cold. For him, time stretches. He waits not for seconds or minutes, but for as long as necessary. When a target appears in his field of view, everything happens instantly. One shot, no rush, no haste. After that, silence again. Simo does not leave the position immediately. He stays where he is because he knows that panic and searches will begin somewhere else. Soldiers try to understand where the shot came from. They look at trees, snowdrifts, and the forest line, but they find nothing. No flash, no smoke, no movement. The forest remains as empty as it was a moment before. Gradually, fear begins to change behavior. They move more slowly, stop more often, listen to every sound. But this only worsens the situation. The longer they remain in open areas, the higher the risk. The greater the tension, the harder it becomes to maintain control. It is here that the turning point occurs. Losses stop being just numbers. They become a feeling. Soldiers no longer fear battle. They fear moving forward. They fear looking into the white silence of the forest. They fear that death can come without warning. A system accustomed to open confrontation begins to lose stability because what acts against it is not a unit and not a tactic in the usual sense. What acts against it is a man who has turned waiting, silence, and cold into weapons. And this is only the beginning. Because while the Soviet army tries to understand what is happening, Simo Häyhä continues to do what he does best. He remains invisible. And with each new loss, confusion begins to turn into real fear. Over time, it becomes clear that what is happening is not accidental. Losses repeat with frightening regularity. They do not depend on direction of movement, time of day, or the size of units. The deeper soldiers move into the forest, the higher the chance that someone will not return. Command demands explanations. The first theories appear: enemy groups, hidden positions, snipers working in pairs. But none of these theories are confirmed. There are no movement traces, no captured positions, not even a clear understanding of how many enemies are operating in the area. You feel the atmosphere change. Before, the forest was perceived as terrain. Now it becomes a threat. Every snowdrift seems suspicious. Every shadow between trees creates tension. Soldiers no longer look forward with confidence. They look around. They search for danger where it cannot be seen. Simo Häyhä continues to act at his own pace. He does not increase speed. He does not chase records. He acts methodically. He chooses targets that weaken movement. Commanders, messengers, those on whom order depends. After each shot, he disappears again, dissolving into the snow. Attempts to track him lead to even greater losses. Soldiers open chaotic fire into the forest. They shoot at trees, snowdrifts, emptiness. But this brings no result. Every shot only reveals their position and strengthens the feeling of helplessness. Rumors begin to spread. They say that it is not a man operating in the forest, but something else. Something impossible to see. Something that leaves no traces. Something that knows where you will appear before you realize it yourself. These conversations do not appear in reports, but they change behavior more than any order. You stand at your position and realize that the most terrifying thing is not the shot. The most terrifying thing is the waiting. You do not know where death will come from. You do not know when it will come. And you do not know if there is anything you can do to avoid it. It is at this moment that confusion begins to turn into something greater. This is no longer a question of tactics or training. It is the feeling that a force is acting against you that cannot be placed into calculations. A force that does not attack directly, but slowly breaks confidence. The Soviet army still tries to think in categories of offense and defense. But here, these categories stop working. Because war no longer looks like war. It looks like a hunt. And you begin to understand that in this hunt, you are not the hunter. Over time, the Soviet command begins to understand that the situation is slipping out of control. Losses continue, morale drops, movement slows. A decision is made to intensify the search. Special groups are sent into the forest. Soldiers receive orders not to advance, but to hunt, not to attack, but to find and destroy whoever is behind what is happening. The forest is swept in grids. Additional sentries are posted. Units move in chains, carefully examining every area. The tension is almost physical. Everyone now knows that an enemy is somewhere nearby, but no one knows exactly where. You move slowly, trying not to make noise. Every step feels too loud. Snow crunches under boots. Your breathing becomes uneven. You catch yourself fearing not the shot, but the silence after it. Because it is in that silence that the realization comes that someone has disappeared again. Simo Häyhä stays in position longer than usual. The search becomes denser. Soldiers pass closer. Noises grow louder. At some point, the distance between him and the enemy becomes dangerously small. He hears footsteps. He hears voices. He hears branches breaking under heavy boots. Any movement now could be the last. He does not change position. He does not attempt to withdraw. He knows that a sudden retreat would reveal him faster than stillness. His breathing is steady. His face is covered with snow. The rifle is aimed, but the finger does not pull the trigger. Soldiers pass by. They look in another direction. They search where logic says the enemy should be, and they do not notice the one who is literally only meters away. The forest once again sides with the one who knows how to become part of its silence. After this episode, it becomes clear that even intensified searching brings no result. The system operates by rules that do not work here. It looks for movement, signs of presence, activity, but it encounters someone who exists outside those signs. For the soldiers, this becomes a turning point. Fear stops being abstract. It takes shape. People begin to believe that they are facing not just a sniper, but something that cannot be caught. Something that is always one step ahead. It is here that a legend is born, still whispered, still without a name. But already it is clear that this enemy is no longer perceived as a man. He becomes part of the forest, part of the cold, and part of the war itself. Over time, the Soviet command begins to realize that what is happening cannot be explained by chance. Losses continue, but familiar measures bring no results. Increased security, route changes, and higher troop density do not reduce the threat. On the contrary, the more soldiers enter the forest, the greater the tension becomes. An attempt is made to restore control. Additional units are sent into advancing areas. Commanders are ordered to act more cautiously, but faster. Delay becomes as dangerous as moving forward. The system demands a solution, but does not understand what it is fighting against. For the soldiers, this is felt most sharply. The forest stops being space and turns into a source of threat. Any pause feels deadly. Any movement raises suspicion. People stop trusting silence and begin to fear it more than combat. Under these conditions, every action of Simo Häyhä produces a multiplied effect. He no longer simply shoots. He controls enemy behavior. A single shot can stop a column. One missing soldier forces a unit to change its route. His presence is felt even where he is not physically present. Soviet units begin to cluster tightly, trying not to separate. But this only limits their maneuverability and makes movement predictable. The logic of numerical superiority begins to work against itself. The more people there are, the harder they are to control in conditions of fear. Commanders demand initiative, but initiative disappears. Soldiers increasingly act not by orders, but by instinct. They look not forward, but around. Their attention is focused not on the mission, but on survival. The offensive loses tempo and internal confidence. Simo Häyhä continues to act as he always has. He does not accelerate. He does not take unnecessary risks. He does not give in to excitement. His strength lies in repetition and predictability for himself, and total unpredictability for the enemy. He remains part of the landscape, not an active participant in battle in the usual sense. By this point, it becomes clear that sniper warfare has gone beyond tactics. It has turned into psychological pressure at a strategic level. One man, acting outside the rules, breaks a system built on calculations and numbers. It is here that the operation against Finland begins to lose the meaning for which it was conceived. Not because of defeat in a specific battle, but because of the destruction of confidence. For the first time, the Soviet army faces an opponent who cannot be defeated by force, because he does not obey the logic of force. By early March, the situation reaches its limit. The Soviet command realizes that a factor is operating in the combat zone that cannot be neutralized by standard means. Losses continue, the tempo of the operation slows, and troop morale deteriorates. The forest remains silent, but that silence becomes the main source of pressure. A decision is made to act more harshly. Areas of suspected sniper presence are subjected to massive bombardment. Mortars, artillery, and dense area fire are used. The goal is no longer to detect the enemy. The goal is to destroy everything that might conceal the threat. The forest turns into a zone of total suppression. Simo Häyhä remains within the fire zone. He does not change his method. His position is chosen to endure bombardment, not to avoid it. He does not seek a new shelter and does not withdraw deep into the rear. He continues to operate in the same rhythm he is accustomed to. But the space around him begins to shrink. On March 6th, what had been avoided until then finally occurs. During one episode of intense combat, Häyhä is severely wounded. A bullet strikes his face. The impact is nearly fatal. He loses consciousness and falls, disappearing from the battlefield as suddenly as he once appeared. For the Soviet units, this event goes unnoticed. No clarity emerges. No one records the moment when the threat disappears. Tension does not subside immediately. The search continues because fear does not vanish together with its source. It outlives facts. Häyhä survives. He is found by Finnish soldiers and evacuated. He regains consciousness several days later, after the fighting has ended. His war ends not by order and not by retreat, but by a sudden rupture of the silence in which he existed. By this time, the operation is effectively exhausted. Finnish resistance is not broken as planned. The Soviet army achieves formal objectives, but at a cost that proves unexpectedly high. And most importantly, what remains is not in reports, but in memory. The sniper no longer acts, but the effect of his presence does not disappear. It remains in soldier behavior, in commander decisions, in the sense that even absolute superiority does not guarantee control. One man altered the course of the operation not by destroying an army, but by stripping it of confidence. This is where the third act of the story ends. Not with a shot and not with victory, but with the realization that war can be halted not by force, but by fear of what cannot be seen. After the gunfire in the forest fades, the war continues as usual for most. Maps are updated, front lines are fixed, reports move up the chain of command. But at the human level, something has already changed. Units that pass through this sector retain a feeling that cannot be expressed in numbers. Soldiers return from the forest different. They no longer trust silence. They look at snow, trees, and empty terrain with suspicion. Even where no enemy is present, they feel one. The experience of facing an invisible threat stays with them longer than any order. Commanders also draw conclusions. Officially, losses are explained by harsh conditions, frost, difficult terrain, and enemy resistance. But in closed conversations, something else is said. That the system failed. That numerical superiority proved useless against someone who did not follow the familiar logic of war. The name Simo Häyhä does not appear immediately. At first, there are rumors, fragments of conversations, stories passed in low voices. He is called different names, but the essence is the same. One man, white clothing, forest, silence. Gradually, these elements form an image that stops being just a soldier. This is how the legend of the White Death is born. Not as an official history and not as propaganda, but as an attempt to explain the unexplainable. When an army faces something it cannot defeat by conventional means, it turns it into a myth. Because myth is easier to accept than admitting a system's vulnerability. For the Finnish side, Häyhä becomes a symbol of resistance. Not a loud hero and not a public figure, but the embodiment of the idea that even in a hopeless situation, control is possible. That knowledge of terrain, patience, and discipline can equalize odds where numbers fail. For the Soviet side, the experience remains painful. It does not fit into standard reports and does not become a subject of open analysis. But it influences thinking. Attitudes toward forests, sniper threats, and soldier psychology change. Because it becomes clear that fear can be a weapon of strategic importance. Häyhä himself does not seek fame after the war. He does not write memoirs, give statements, or turn his experience into a public story. He returns to a quiet life as if confirming the central paradox of this war. A man feared by thousands chooses to disappear from attention. But disappearance does not mean oblivion. His story continues to live in military memory, in manuals, in discussions of sniper warfare, not as a count of shots, but as an example of how one person can change the behavior of an entire army. This is where the main consequence of this episode of the Winter War becomes clear. It showed that war is not only a clash of forces, it is a clash of perception, and those who can control fear and expectation are capable of altering events without massive battles. The story of Simo Häyhä does not end with a shot, and it does not end with the war. It continues in the silence that remains afterward, the same silence that Soviet soldiers remembered more strongly than any orders or assaults. The Winter War became a lesson that could not be reduced to a simple formula. It showed that superiority in numbers, technology, and firepower does not guarantee control. Because control begins not on the map, but in the mind of the person moving forward. Simo Häyhä did not stop an army in the literal sense. The advance continued. The front moved, decisions were made, but he did something more important. He changed behavior. He forced people to hesitate, to wait, to fear. He turned confidence into caution and strength into vulnerability. This is his true impact, not in the number of targets hit and not in records, but in what he proved. Sometimes wars are decided not by those who shoot louder, but by those who know how to wait, not by those who advance, but by those who turn space itself into a trap. The White Death became a legend not because he was invisible, but because he was understood too late, when fear had already entered the system and began to function on its own, without shots and without presence. Today, this story is seen as an episode of the past, but its meaning remains relevant. Any system built on rules and calculations is vulnerable to those who operate outside those rules, especially when they understand psychology better than weapons. Simo Häyhä did not seek to change history. He simply did his job, but sometimes that is enough for history to change on its own. And perhaps the most unsettling conclusion of this war is simple. The most dangerous weapon is not the bullet. It is the fear of what cannot be seen,